while you're doing that, I'll explain. So for this segment, we're debating what's better, the Nintendo 3DS, which includes the DS, or the Game Boy Advance as a console, as a library, everything. We're just debating which one's better. The catch, we don't know which side we're defending. So Alex is going to get a coin flip app up, and whoever wins, whatever, will get assigned it, and then we'll just have to defend it from then on.
There we go. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
All right. Spencer, I'll let you call it.
One second. Alex is in cyberspace right now.
Yeah. Who gets what? Who gets what? I don't know what happened.
Okay, I think you're back.
What? Am I still in cyberspace?
I think you're
okay.
You're not in cyberspace
Spencer,
anymore.
I'm gonna let you.
Okay.
I'm back. I'm back from the future.
If I get it right, I get the 3DS. Okay. Heads.
GBA. Oh shit! Can I turn? Let me adjust my brightness. There we go.
Wow, this is breaking his thing. It's cyberspace again.
Oh, it's tail. You got tails.
Oh, bummer. Well, then
was it only doing that when I showed the? Was it only when I showed my phone to the camera? Was it too much?
Yeah, it's really weird. Is every time you tried to, every time you did it, it
seemed
was
like both
stuck.
Both. Oh wait, well you got tail, so I'm 3DS and you're GBA.
Okay. You can tell what I. Okay.
Did you have your heart set on 3DS? I mean, I'm not gonna give it to you, but
I just have a preference. That's fine.
Okay.
Debate. Okay. Now I'm in full GBA mode.
Okay. Yeah.
Bring.
3. Okay. Today, I'm here to talk about the amazing Nintendo console, the Nintendo 3DS, which is the last in a long legacy of Nintendo handhelds, and spawned from the very successful Nintendo DS, one of the most revolutionary handhelds of all time. The 3DS pushes what the DS did and more, with its fantastic library of games, its 3D features, and its portability. There hasn't been a console like the 3DS since the 3DS, and I don't think there ever will be again. My opponent tonight is going to talk about his little 2D games. You'll notice all of his games are in 2D.
It's not true.
Which sir, I'm speaking, and which all of his little cartridge Game Boy games, whatever he's playing over there on his little 2D handheld that runs on AA batteries. It's cute. It's very cute. But we're talking about real 3D games over here. I think we have some really impressive things to talk about. We're really going to blow you away, and hopefully by the end of today's debate, you'll choose to pick up a 3DS.
Okay, my opponent said a lot of really slanderous things about his thing and about my thing, so I think that's really interesting. The Game Boy Advance was completely revolutionary. It was able to translate the 16-bit architecture into a handheld and actually improve it, which I think is incredible. One cool thing about the Game Boy Advance is that it is enhancing Super Nintendo games, which everyone remembers Super Nintendo as one of the golden eras of Nintendo. Whereas the DS and 3DS were able to replicate N64 hardware. Remember all the good N64 games? Oh, chirp, chirp, chirp. Yeah, not a whole lot there. But so instantly the Game Boy Advance is already heralding from an era that's better than the DS was. He said some interesting things about 3D versus 2D. I'd be curious what kind of 3DS he currently has. I would suggest it's probably a Nintendo 2DS. So I find that very interesting. I think what's interesting about the Game Boy Advance is that it had a gimmick and the gimmick was simple and consistent. Was it's everything the Game Boy was, but advanced. The Game Boy had two buttons. The Game Boy Advance had the shoulder buttons. Uh, the Game Boy did 8-bit. The Game Boy Advance did 16-bit. It was just advanced. It was better. Whereas the DS and specifically 3DS, literally nobody gives a shit about the 3DS capabilities. In fact, most people turned them off for the majority of them playing that handheld. So the Game Boy Advance had a gimmick that it used. The 3DS had a gimmick that nobody used and everyone turned off. So that's my opening statement. One is clearly better.
All right, let's talk about the games. I will let my opponent go first.
Game Boy Advance has an extensive library, pulling not just from the Super Nintendo, but creating its own classics in the process. It had a ton of support from Square Enix, SquareSoft. I think it that was part of the transition time. It had a lot of Final Fantasy games on it that were remade for it. It had a lot of original games that came out. It had classic Nintendo games like Mario Kart. It had one of my favorite Zelda game, which is the Minish Cap, as well as essentially Capcom Zelda games was what it was famous for. Specifically that one, and it could play all the Game Boy games as well. So you have Pokemon on it. You have the other Capcom Zelda games, like any of those Game Boy classics, Tetris. So Tetris and Pokemon alone, Pokemon Red and Blue, and then Gold and Silver, are part of, you could argue, the Game Boy Advance library. I can't think of two series of games that are more famous and synonymous with gaming. So Game Boy Advance library it would be too impossible for me to name every game that came out that was great because there are so many. So I'll just say tons of great games and some of the most important games of all time you can play on the Game Boy Advance.
I think it's cute that my opponent today is going to talk about backwards compatibility and third-party support. Let's start with the third-party support. Because not only do you expect great Nintendo games from a Nintendo handheld, which there were plenty. I mean, I'm talking 3D Mario's, I'm talking Zelda games, Pokemon, Animal Crossing. There were plenty of great first-party Nintendo games. But outside of that, you did have support from companies like Square Enix, which brought over some of their Dragon Quest games in full remake. You had, Capcom was on the console with plenty of Monster Hunter and Resident Evil titles. Those are two big series, on your little handheld. You had a Metal Gear Solid 3 came to the handheld. There's a pretty good library of games from third-party support. But let's talk about the backwards compatibility, because he was really toting his backwards compatibility. I would like for the audience to know that Pokemon Red and Blue and Yellow are also part of my library, along with Pokemon Gold and Silver, the Pokemon trading card game. They are all backwards compatible through the virtual eShop library. You can buy those Game Boy games and play them there. So not only do you get Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, you also got Game Gear games, Super Nintendo games, and NES games. So on the same handheld, you could have Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Zelda Link's Awakening, A Link to the Past, Ocarina of Time, and Majora's Mask, all in your pocket. That's and Oracle Seasons, Oracle of Ages. That is so much Zelda, so much classic Zelda, along with the 3DS exclusive Link Between Worlds. That is so much Zelda you could play right there in the palm of your hands. Yeah, and just the backwards compatibility with the DS library is insane, because the DS was one of the biggest handhelds of all time, bigger than the GBA. I mean, whenever they brought out the DS, they basically just dropped the GBA then and there. It was dead. The DS had a huge library of beloved RPGs, platformers, puzzle games, narrative games, casual games, just all sorts of stuff. Everybody had a game for the DS. If you liked a certain type of game, it was on there. And guess what? You could play that on my 3DS. And the 3DS was so popular that whenever the Nintendo Switch came out, the 3DS still lasted 2 more years. They had games going into 2019. That's
Hmm.
pretty crazy. So, they dropped the GBA right away once they found something better with the DS, but they couldn't get rid of that old 3DS. No, they still had to keep that around for a while because people love that thing.
I do want to just quickly say that I think you're mistaking backwards compatibility with DLC, and I think those are two
No,
very
it's not.
different things.
No,
Like you're saying that it's
no.
backwards compatible, that it can play, you can download Pokemon.
Yeah.
Um, can you download it now? I would be
Yeah.
curious. You can go and download it
Uh,
now.
not Probably not by legal means,
Oh, oh, so it's good for
but
criminals.
you can.
So 3DS is good for
You
criminals.
can.
I just want to make sure we understand that.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, 3DS is good for people that are creative and know how to use the technology they own. Not for babies that take big Game Boy cartridges and shove them into the top of their Game Boy and pay too much at retro game stores for that copy of Pokemon Red. That's probably not even real.
Good for criminals. Okay, we can move on to the next topic if you'd like. Hardware.
Okay? Let's talk about the hardware.
Obviously, you can't compare one directly to the other because 3DS came out way later. So you have to really compare what we're looking at the time. And I think GBA was revolutionary in that it could play Super Nintendo games and make them look better. I think that's the important part, is that they were able to add to the Super Nintendo palette and um, and processor. Whereas if you look at a Nintendo DS and 3DS, specifically 3DS, because that's what we're talking about, I don't know that it ever really added to the N64 in any noticeable way. In fact, I think its resolution was probably less than the N64's native resolution. So it actually is like playing an N64 game that's worse, which I don't know if that was the intention. That seems kind of like a little bit backwards for me. Um, I think for a lot of gamers, that little stylus that like let me clue you in. A cool thing about the Nintendo 3DS is that it has a little slot at the bottom, and inside of that is a stylus, and you can pull that stylus out, and that bottom screen is actually a touchpad that you can do stuff with. Most people don't know that because most people don't use the 3DS in any way that they would use a stylus because it's inconvenient. But that's a cool thing about the 3DS that most people don't know. Also, you can turn this slider on that adds a 3D effect that nobody uses because it gives them a headache. So that's a cool thing that people don't know about on the 3DS. The Game Boy Advance, everybody's able to take advantage of the hardware, and in the SP version, it even had a backlight, which was new for these kinds of handhelds. So it actually pushed handhelds further and made them more commonplace to be advanced. Hence Game Boy Advance. Whereas Nintendo DS had a lot of gimmicks. Remember, did you know it also you can in the 3DS it has a microphone and you can blow into it and use it for video games? How fun. How nice. I wonder how many games took advantage of that. So a lot of fluff on the 3DS, a lot of required, useful, advancing technologies in the Game Boy Advance.
My opponent thinks it's a flex that he has a light in his screen. Oh, and in the SP model, oh wow, you can see your video game. How nice! Thank you, Nintendo. So cool. Um, so the 3DS hardware went through many different phases, as you know, many different iterations. We had the 3DS, we had the new 3DS, we had the 3DS XL, we had the new 3DS XL, we even had the 2DS. All of them are very viable. All of them have fantastic screens. They all play a lot of different games. It's funny he was knocking the fact that his that like his console had Super Nintendo games and my console, oh, the games even look better, because I think a game or two from every single Nintendo generation was on the 3DS. Of course, I talked about NES and Super Nintendo was there through Virtual Console. There was N64 games, as he's alluded to, that got remakes. GameCube games, Luigi's Mansion got a remake. on the 3DS. That's a GameCube game. One of his, or actually two of his games with Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire. Yoink! That's mine now, baby. I got that. The game from the Wii, a little game called Xenoblade Chronicles. That's a big old Wii game that came to 3DS. Wii U games came to 3DS. Hyrule Warriors, Captain Toad, yeah, those are on 3DS. Switch games are on 3DS. Fire Emblem Warriors, yeah, that's a Switch game. And guess what? That's on the so literally a game from every single Nintendo generation exists on the 3DS. He's over there trying to tout that he could play Super Nintendo games. The 3DS could do anything, and it was magic. Sure, people don't like using the 3D. It has some uses in some games. Super Mario 3D Land, you basically need it for that, for some of the puzzles and stuff in that game. Very innovative, very fun, but we like giving you the choice of using those features or not. Something that I think is interesting is that with the Game Boy Advance SP, he didn't even bring this up. They introduced a clamshell design. Very nice design, but you can't actually close that clamshell on the SP and suspend your game. So it makes it very inconvenient for taking it on the go, because you're going to power it off and power it back on every single time. With the DS and 3DS line of consoles, you can suspend your game and close the clamshell and put it in your pocket, put it in your bag, and pick it up later and play where you left off, which is a very nice feature that he wishes he had. So the 3DS is clearly a powerhouse, and he's clearly jealous of what the 3DS had and what it's capable of doing.
I love that the guy on the other side of the aisle said that you could play all of those games from different consoles all the way up to the Switch. It's like, yeah, here's the advertisement for that. Do you want to play all those games in the worst possible way? Like, you want the worst version of all these games? Here it is on the 3DS. That's essentially what those are. Yeah, I completely disagree. I think the Game Boy Advance pushed it forward. The 3DS was always holding those games back, and I think time will agree with that. But speaking of all those different, how it stacks up with time, what if we move on to legacy?
Ooh.
What's the legacy of the Nintendo 3DS?
See, I already know where this is going to go with my opponent, because there's a little thing on his side called nostalgia. See, my console is still not old enough to have a nostalgic fan base yet. It hasn't entered that era, and quite frankly, it's because it feels too new. It feels too powerful compared to his console. His console is something that a lot of people his age played when they were in middle school, when they were in elementary school, whenever they're in high school. For him, it was probably after he got out of high school, whenever he was working his first job and sad and alone. Yeah, he the nostalgia is there for the Game Boy Advance, not because it's better, just because people missed 20 years ago. The 3DS is going to have a lasting legacy, and we're starting to see that now, because a lot of the 3DS library is getting very, very expensive because people want those games. Even though the Switch 2 just came out, people still want those 3DS games that you're going to have to pay a pretty penny to get them. And whether that's good or bad depends on how you view the value of a console. But it definitely, says that there is a market, people that still love and respect and want to play 3DS.
Kind of like what I was talking about before, though. I think that a lot of the DS and 3DS games are ports, you could argue, or remakes, quote unquote. And they're usually the worst versions of those games. So I would be curious if people actually want to buy those for the games, or they just want to buy them so that they can sit on their shelves and say that they had them. Game Boy Advance is notorious for having games that people want to play, that people like to take out of the box and play, as opposed to games you can download from the eShop that no longer exists. Ooh, that's weird, awkward. I think the legacy for Game Boy Advance will be um, a reflection of an era of games that are now ahead of their time. I think it kick-started a lot of series, including Fire Emblem. I don't know if you knew that, but in America, that was when we got our first actual Fire Emblem game, which is
I
now a
thought we had
huge.
the first actual Fire Emblem. Oh, sorry, we had the first popular Fire Emblem game. I'm sorry. My apologies.
Untrue, but uh, yeah, the Game Boy Advance comes from an era. Its counterpart was the GameCube, and a lot of people reference that as the era that they like most of Nintendo. Well, this was the counterpart to it, and even had the ability to play these games on the GameCube. There's a connector for it. So I think you can't really shortchange the importance of this game as part of Nintendo's ultimate legacy. That, by the way, was so successful that they created the Nintendo 2 DS, which would lead to the 3DS. What did the 3DS lead to? Did they create another handheld for it? Oh, actually, they stopped making it because they moved on to a Switch that took the console place, but they didn't actually build another handheld. In fact, I think they started just doing like mobile games, like on phones, because, I think that's the
Well,
legacy that we're looking at, is that Nintendo 3DS did so well that they just make games for phones now. Gross.
what actually happened was that the 3DS did so well and their console market was so bad at the time, they took what was working from the 3DS and applied it to their console market. So in many ways, the 3DS upgraded to the Switch. A lot of the development teams and series moved from 3DS to Switch. You think Fire Emblem, you think Pokemon, you think Monster Hunter, you think a lot of those different games that were very popular on 3DS, Animal Crossing. Those teams moved from working on a handheld to a hybrid because Nintendo needed the power of the
Mm.
powerhouse of those development studios from 3DS. They couldn't do it on home console. They were look at the Wii U. They were failing with the Wii U. They needed what was on 3DS, and that's exactly where the Switch came in.
I'm curious when you say that they took the things that were successful from the 3DS and moved them to console. So what does the Switch have that the 3DS had?
Animal Crossing,
No.
Fire Emblem.
Don't
Oh no,
don't name
Fire
games
Emblem.
because that's a necessity. That's not because they wanted to. That's because there was no other option.
No, no,
That's
no,
because
no,
there's
no,
no
no.
other
They don't
option.
have to do that.
Yes, they did. I'm asking you what from the 3DS specifically. Like, were there two screens on the Switch?
You could buy two Switches.
They actually wait. No. They made a console with two screens. It's called the Wii U. Was that a success? Oh,
That wasn't the 3DS. I'll tell you that. I'll tell you that
no,
much.
interesting.
Okay. So my opponent talks about me having so many remakes. I want him to name his original Mario platformer. Staple of the Nintendo handheld, the Mario platformer. What was your original Mario platformer? Did you have one? Did you have an original Mario platformer game?
I don't think it did.
Yeah, you didn't, because all your Mario games
It just did the
were
classics.
remakes of
Yeah, it
older
did the
games. Yeah, of
classics.
older games.
Okay, what are the
Okay.
original ones on the DS and 3DS? That are
Mario 3D Land, New Super Mario
New
Brothers.
Super Mario.
2.
Do you like New Super
Yeah,
Mario Brothers? I think that's a good game.
People do.
Do you think that's a
There's an
good
audience for it.
game?
There is an audience for it. Yeah. Luigi's Mansion 2 was an original.
Ooh.
Yeah.
Ooh.
The most of the GBA library was remakes as well. The 3DS though had, I think it split the difference between remakes and original games throughout its lifetime, and also remakes of games you never expected. I mean, the 3DS single-handedly brought back Metroid with Samus Returns, and
I would argue Game
that's a
Boy
big
Advance
thing
brought back Metroid.
No, I would argue Game Boy Advance killed it because that was the last time we ever saw a traditional Metroid game. Yeah,
Wow!
dead for a while.
Wow! Wow! Excuse me? The Game Boy Advance
Yeah.
killed Metroid? I think I just won the argument
Yeah.
right now because of that statement.
No, it was the Wii that killed Metroid.
Yes, that's actually correct. That's factually.
That's actually correct. It was neither of us. I know. I just wanted to throw some mud.
Okay, I think we're at the end here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
All
The 3DS is my favorite console
right.
ever.
Oh,
The 3DS.
man, I just came out of a. Oh, what happened? I like blacked out for like 30 minutes. What happened?
I never thought I would have to argue against the 3DS, which is like literally my favorite console of all time. So
I think these are. I mean,
that was a challenge.
the 3DS is the 3DS is probably my favorite Nintendo handheld. But honestly, I picked this because I think the 3DS and the GBA are equals almost. I think in terms of like Nintendo handhelds, I think they are. I know people like to say maybe the DS is up there, but like I think I don't. I would never recommend anybody get a DS. I would just recommend them get a 3DS. But I
Right.
would recommend somebody get a GBA. Like I do think the GBA is still really good and like still has a lot to offer.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
so
They're both
yeah,
good,
so
but to me, the
yeah, so
3DS is. Well,
oh yeah,
if you look at my
I still
library,
play
it's
3DS.
insane. It's the only thing I have a lot of games for because I love it so much. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I still find myself playing 3DS like regularly. I play GBA sometimes. It's like off and on with that. It's like when I'm mainly when I'm just in that mood for like something more retro.